A very good friend of mine sent me the link to this video this morning, and this is something that we all know, but choose to ignore. We all know, but choose to ignore. I'm going to create a bit of a commentary here because it applies to the idea of context, not just information that is being given to us, the atrocity committed in via official stories. I'm going to just run this for about a couple of minutes and then have a brief commentary on this.
April 3rd, 1991. The Security Council's Resolution 687 calls for the constitution of a special UN commission to proceed to an immediate inspection of Iraq's biological, nuclear, and chemical warfare capacity. This resolution entrusts Iraq's disarmament to the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, and a special ad hoc commission, the UNSCOM.
Flags should go up. The IAEA, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for the Planet, one of the most corrupt organizations, reinforcing the richest industry ever created on Earth, called nuclear energy, nuclear power, nuclear mining, bombs, and the peaceful atom, and an organization that was specifically created called UNSCOM, United Nations Special Commission, to set the stage for the aggression against this country called Iraq, which is still going on 15 years later. I'll just run this a bit more.
Between 1991 and 1998, during their 8 years' work in Iraq, the UNSCOM officials visited more than 9,000 sites and destroyed 48 long-range missiles, 40 non-mobile launch pads, 30 chemical warheads, 38,537 chemical munitions, 275 tons of chemicals, and 100 tons of solid explosives. Hundreds of machines and thousands of units of chemical, biological, strategic, and ballistic equipment were completely destroyed. The entire ballistic arsenal of Iraq was dismantled. Iraq was disarmed.
I firmly believe that the motivation and the motives of a person like Richard Butler had a lot to do with the political decision-making in Washington. And
Richard Butler was in charge of the UNSCOM. He had a CIA background, and he was reporting directly back to U.S. governments, the U.S. government officials, and he was a front man in order to lay the path for the atrocities that are still being committed under the name of democracy. All you Americans and Canadians and any Western country that is still adhering to the official story, as you just heard, it was completely clear that there were no weapons of mass destruction. I mean, people know this, but choose to ignore it. I just feel like I don't generally talk about current events and the facts, ma'am, but I'm going to give a contextual commentary at the end of this. I'll run this a little bit more.
I think history will ultimately come to the conclusion that it was Mr. Butler who is squarely to be blamed for having provided to the Americans and the British the key in December, in fact on the 15th of December 1998, to open the door for the bombardment against Iraq and for the intensification of conflict between the Security Council and Iraq.
All right, so we know the history after this. The bomb started to fall because the official story had Iraq as a renegade regime about to destroy Western civilization, I suppose, whatever people have in their minds. Now, this is my commentary, again, on the context. And I have said this before, that maybe this is appropriate on Halloween as well, having a our romance with the Grim Reaper. What does that actually mean? I think I'd like to explain this. As in my previous video, I referred to Fukushima, Halloween, and the Grim Reaper, the romance we have with the Grim Reaper. And what I think is very important for people to realize in themselves, like in myself, I understand that there is enormous desire, an inner, let's call it a pathology that has to be resolved, understood, looked at, chosen to act against, that some people more than others have a proclivity, a desire to indulge impulses. And one of the impulses is to create hurt and suffering. Suffering and hurt, for whatever reason, has a special sense of gratification in a lot of people. And it varies in degrees. The hurt and suffering inflicted from a level of, let's say, abuse of mental abuse, or even as children learn to navigate their way through the natural world, and you abuse other living creatures and realize this is somehow wrong. This is where conscience comes in. I always say that even as a child, I remembered in some of my depraved investigations and practices on I truly regret this, and with experimenting on frogs and the ants, and you know what kids do, and you finally realize something is really wrong here. But the idea is we can stop this. I know in myself I could stop this within myself as well. But this is on a level, on a scale that is destroying the very fabric of our nature. When we take and escalate this abuse into a ritual format, which is considered, I think it's war in general. War in general is the context of creating ritual sacrifice and abuse that satisfies a contingent of a really degenerate, sick bunch of psychopaths that are running the show. And also it satisfies the silent majority. Who came up with that name, silent majority, who is compliant with this form of vicarious satisfaction of seeing people suffer. The people that suffer still suffer, will suffer for generations, very likely, because of the depleted uranium that was pumped into the Iraqi desert. Fallujah is no longer capable of sustaining life in any normal way. Women are bearing children with enormous deformities from the nuclear pollution that has been unleashed on the desert. So I'm going to put a link to this video that my friend, a good friend who works for UNESCO, I have difficulty in any kind of UN operation, but this fellow Halliday, I think it was his name, and Scott Ritter, who resigned from UNSCOM, the United Nations Special Commission, to lay the groundwork. They resigned because Iraq was being set up by this pathological group that run the US, British governments primarily. Canada is complicit as well. So the important thing that I just wanted to say is that there is a context for this, and it's the sense, and Halloween reinforces this in us, like I said in my last video, this sense of continuing an abuse that confirms within us we have certain pathological desires to inflict suffering. And this needs to be, this is happening on the most, when I say the day-to-day life, we have this, we confront this in ourselves every day in terms of how we act in our immediate environment. Do we do the right thing in terms of our ecology, in terms of our relationships, in terms of other creatures? Do we begin to do the right thing, or we have this unleashed? And this is going to be mayhem unless we get this under control within ourselves. This is so important. And I generally don't talk about the facts, ma'am, out there, how terrible things are. And if you see this video, it's just debilitating, psychically debilitating when you see the suffering. But that's the point, you see. The point is for these psychotics to satisfy their desire, their need for massive the massive bloodletting that is instigated, and under the name of the United Nations, which is just a front. The official story and people that are involved with it resigned. This fellow resigned, Scott Ritter resigned, and were replaced by people that would go along with the idea of destroying physically, emotionally, psychically, what it is we've built, the goodness in us has built over a long time is being dismantled now. And Fukushima is the jewel in the crown, for this dismantling of our very essence. It is happening. It is happening. And this is check this video out. I was tremendously, Tariq Aziz is, I think he's a straightforward person in this. He comes off very truthful, and I'm not going to get into how brutal these masters, these Saddam Hussein types who run a show, these tyrants, yeah, and they're placed there. You see the history with Rumsfeld meeting him, and they're all just operatives on a certain scale, and then they're sacrificed themselves in order to satisfy this deep longing and desire by the worst part within an individual to create suffering and mayhem and even murder and ritual child abuse. And in Canada, it happened with residential schools and is going on everywhere on the planet. We got to stop this somehow. And the only way I say we can stop this is by doing the inner work. We got to do the inner work, people.